We'll start with introductions. So my name is Joe Gordon. I'm Vice President of Innovation and Technology at a company called Veranex. We're a product development consultancy in the healthcare space. It's actually about 2 years old at this point. It's actually a conglomeration or a series of acquisitions. So it's 10 different companies at this point that really span the healthcare development market. So everything from commercial strategy, market access, the earliest stages of user research, product design and engineering is the group that I'm part of, which is associated with a legacy company called Zymedica, based down in Providence. And we also have locations in Minnesota and California as well. And then we also have preclinical facilities, pretty famous, world-renowned place in Paris called IMMR was the legacy company, able to do large animal GLP studies, over 1,000 procedures a year. And we can take that development right up through the clinical trials and even do the clinical trial data system. So it's really kind of, the goal was to develop an end-to-end system, and so far we've been successful in doing so. I also want to introduce my colleagues here that are joining with me. So Ken, I'll have you go first.
Sure. I don't know how loud I should talk. I'm Ken Gall, one of the founders of Restor3D. I'll talk about that in a second. My background is technical, so I have a PhD in mechanical engineering and really expertise in biomaterials, 3D printing, how to put new synthetic materials in the body. Restor3D is a personalized orthopedic company. Just acquired Conformis, which is a local company here, so kind of in combination with them, we do personalized devices for orthopedics across hip, knee, spine, total ankle, shoulder, and it really focused. The company was built from the ground up to really use 3D printing and kind of digital technologies to build devices on demand for patients.
And Sarath?
Sure. I'm Sarath Krishnaswamy. I'm currently the Vice President for Operational Technology at Smith & Nephew. So my responsibility there is for digitization and automation across our factory network worldwide. Smith & Nephew is a med device manufacturer with divisions in orthopedics, advanced wound care, and sports medicine, and a bunch of factories over the planet. This is actually kind of my first gig in operations. Before that, and so actually there's an awful lot of karma involved, because for 20 and change years before that, I led R&D organizations, throwing stuff over the wall. Now it kind of lands on me, which has been quite educational. So prior to joining Smith & Nephew, I have led R&D organizations generally in med device or med device adjacent spaces, both at startups, a startup doing automated microbiology inspections, and at large companies. I led engineering at Abbott MediSense early in my career, doing blood glucose meters for clinical and for consumer applications. But in general, and then I led advanced robotics at Amazon for about 3 years. That's really doing advanced grasping and machine vision. So usually most of the things I've been dealing with have been robotics, manipulation, vision, sensing products, generally in the medical sphere.
Great. All right, thank you both. So pretty broad topic today. It's really kind of digital in healthcare. So one of the first things we wanted to really touch on is just a recognition that there's very few standalone products anymore. Seems like everything that's coming out has some sort of a digital ecosystem or accessories or a sensor suite that's really kind of building out more of an information suite. And obviously you hear a lot about data and what's happening with that. But one of the first topics I think we wanted to cover is just the progression of pre, intra, and operative technologies that are evolving in there. So Ken, I'll put it to you first, and just your reaction to how you see this trend progressing over time.
Yeah, thank you. And we have some of our team here as well watching, so if I say anything that's off a little crazy, they're going to correct me. Our company was kind of built from the ground up to embrace the sort of digital side of doing this in the kind of 4 surgeries. And so that comes with a couple different flavors. One of them is digital manufacturing, so thinking about how we go from parts that we've designed into something that can be made with 3D printing or made almost directly as possible. There's components of our processing that are not digital, but that's one big component, and we were founded that way, and Conformis, who we're also partnered with now, was part of that. The other aspects we've been embracing, one is using digital health platforms to try to look at tracking, working with our surgeons, working with our customers, working with patients. And so I think that's another area that we've been exploring, and we're probably halfway down where we want to be and start doing. And so I think that type of technology is critical. And the last kind of leg that digital is making a big difference is, if we think of design, some of the designs we do are manual. So if we get a very, very complex case, we have an engineer that will do that case and work with the surgeon directly. That's probably a non-digitalized process, so to speak. But in cases where we start to see repeated use of conformist knee, for example, or a total shoulder on the Restore side, we're using technologies that make that a much more automated process. And so you take either past decisions, which would be an AI-based approach to actually design the implant, or you're just using certain algorithms and scripting and rules to design the implant automatically. And I think if we truly want to mass customize patient-specific devices, we're all very diverse. If we want to make devices that way, we have to have those in place. So I don't know if that was too long of an answer.
I thought it was pretty good.
Thanks.
You can go long.
I know.
No, I think, so we talked a lot about this before, and it was something we were looking at particularly at J&J, and I've seen it now at Smith & Nephew, which is creating these ecosystems to aggregate data from pre-op and post-op, as well as intra-op, where we've got a lot of sensing already. And I think that there are probably two vectors that really matters on. One is it allows you to collect huge corpuses of data from patients who have your product that you can begin to use to figure out how to personalize better, or which particular aspects of the product affect outcomes, and really think hard about connecting that through design and even manufacture if you've got sensing and manufacture as well. But I think the more profound change is you see when you use that data and begin to work with an individual patient now, before they even get into surgery, and start being able to say things like, or have their doctor say things to them like, hey, lose 20 pounds and we can take 2 weeks off of your recovery time, right? And have the data to back it up, right? So, or hey, we've got sensing and imaging that can look at how you're doing your rehab post-operatively, and if you kind of stick with it, here's what your recovery time is going to be. The implication there is the larger med firms, particularly in ortho, where you're selling big chunks of metal to surgeons, you're actually now switching from selling kind of products to surgeons and healthcare systems to selling outcomes to patients, right? And when I kind of saw this coming in from Amazon, which is customer obsession, right? Everything gets connected to the end customer. It's somewhat refreshing to see more and more of a direct connection to the end customer, even with the large medical companies as well.
That's great. Yeah, and obviously hard tissue, and I actually learned something in the kind of the pre-talk here too. In my mind, it's such a great application, personalized medicine, hard tissue. It should be very predictable based on preoperative imaging. And I was surprised, Ken, you mentioned that there's an impediment for the major medicals to really penetrate that space and making more of these personalized. So Sarath, I'll put it to you. Like, what's challenging about it? Why would that be hard? And obviously Ken has predicated his company on the fact that there's a gap here, and surprised to hear there's a gap.
So I don't think it's technical, probably, and I don't necessarily think it's want to. I think it's just the existing business models that for ortho particularly, the large companies have set in motion makes it really hard to be agile with distribution, for example, right? And so, we have huge inventories of ortho kits in different sizes so that we can make sure intra-op, if the imaging got the size wrong, that the surgeon has another product right there to be able to implant. That makes it really hard to, we've had I remember sitting in discussions. Again, it was somewhat amusing because I was coming from Amazon, where we could get stuff to you in an hour, right? To holy crap, we can't figure out how to create networks to get customized products out to patients in a matter of days, right, or weeks. And for things like trauma plates, that's something where it's really critical that you be able to understand what the specific patient need is and get it out in hours if you can manage it. So I think to me, it's sort of rethinking the business and logistics aspect of it, which I think is a very new thing for big med device companies. I don't know if you'd seen the same thing for kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, I would fully agree. The bigger, larger orthopedic companies they do have a certain inventory. I'm talking about the implant, just the implant. I think they're adapting very well on the digital health side, but on just the implant side, they have an existing inventory base. That's how they do their surgeries. It's been that way for 50 years, and that's hard to disrupt. I do think there's a second factor too, which is the technologies that enable you to do this in a cost-effective way have improved the last 10 years massively. I mean, printing being one of them is a good example. And the large orthopedic companies, Smith & Nephew, J&J, Stryker, they've actually embraced 3D printing of their metal parts pretty strongly, I would say, if you disagree or not.
No, for sure.
They're just printing a lot of the same type of parts. It's the same things they've always made, just maybe different with porosity or something. So it's a question of, will they start to embrace the more personalized side of it? They are embracing some of the base technologies to get there.
Yeah. There's a strong digital factory piece of this as well, right? Because you're in addition to sort of new models for logistics, right? You're really not talking about a problem with R&D and product design trying to get these products out, but actually your factory is thinking differently about what the demand is in the supply chain and everything along that in order to transform. And again, for the larger established companies, you also have larger established factories, right? And workforces and the digital transformation, from my perspective at least, in large med device particularly. I think pharma is very different, but in med device particularly is just well behind what I would think the general state of manufacturing is.
Yeah, I think there's part of this digital transformation is also the physicians want information to make informed decisions as well too, and there's certainly more and more enabling technologies out there to facilitate that. I'd say the cardiovascular space has pioneered a lot of that in terms of visualization aids, and even interoperatively, we were talking about a local company that can overlay perfusion. Some of the stent placement has become almost more like a video game where you're kind of moving it and it tells you exactly when you're in the right spot, and you almost expect a scoreboard to start kind of blinking in the corner as well. How do you guys see that actually progressing? And do you think that that's going to continue to advance at a high rate, or do you think we're starting to kind of plateau here?
Right, throw that? First. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, me first?
Yeah.
Okay. Rats. Yes, so I think it's going to advance at a high rate. I think that it changes the nature of the problem. So I'm strongly opinionated on this. I think the era of big monolithic software is over, and I think probably the era of big monolithic robotic systems is over too, right, or heading there, right? Robots are turning into commodities, and it's more trying to find sensing capabilities or display capabilities or analytic capabilities that you can plug into your ecosystem, right? And so for the larger companies, so smaller companies can develop that. Larger companies aren't super great, with all love, at creating amazing breakthrough sensing technologies, but they're great at acquiring them. And they're great and they own the surgical suite, if you will. So it makes architecture design much, much more important so that you can identify these technologies and swap them in, number one. I had a number two, but I can't remember. I'll throw it to you for a second, and I'll think about what the number two was.
Sure, yeah, I completely agree. I think if you look at the one side, we've not worked as much as the robotic side, and we're exploring and looking into that. But I think that there's been, I think certainly a lot of robotics is something that kind of hit orthopedics pretty strongly. And then there's this whole area of visualization, navigation, the way people are thinking about how to actually navigate the case while it's happening, and then using the patient data to do that. And that's all, in our view, very consistent with patient-specific type of implants, right? So where you're taking the patient's own data and helping the surgeon navigate, and also giving the patient a better implant.
Yeah. That was the number two. Thank you. Yeah, I think the other tricky bit about this is there's a price to sensing data information, right? Which is at the moment, robotic surgery isn't autonomous, which actually makes it a little bit trickier because so it's all generally teleoperated, telerobotic, right? You have a surgeon in the loop who's doing things live, moving things around. Maybe they're constrained, right? But that requires thinking about how that surgeon is interacting with the robot and making it move. and as importantly, how you're taking these multi-dimensional chunks of information. So you're gathering information on perhaps a variety of visual spectra and sensing information and maybe demographic information and maybe real-time guidance, right? This huge, I call it like an n-dimensional ball of data that's live that you have, in the middle of the surgery. Humans are really bad at managing n-dimensional balls of data. We're really good at maybe 2.5-ish dimensions, right? Like we can look at a screen and maybe there's color and maybe motion on top of it. And so a problem I don't think is solved that I find fascinating is how do you slice that n-dimensional ball to create that 2.5-dimensional view that a surgeon can understand that also has clinical relevance, right? I think there's a real fascinating challenge there.
There's a tricky balance there too, right? I mean, I know when Mako came out, first kind of robotics or orthopedic robotic platform, I was kind of amazed with the way they structured, and I think it was genius, and I think it was the right way to do it, but it basically, they took all the preoperative imaging, you could map it directly on the operative site, and then the physician had full control. They were moving that robot. But the robot wouldn't let them make a mistake. They were working with a predefined field, but the physician felt like they were in control. And that's such a critical balance, because if you take that control away from the physicians, there'll be a visceral reaction. They'll push back, they won't embrace it. So I think about artificial intelligence, I think about these data sets, and as you're describing, they want more of this information. What's the balance there? What's the tipping point where you're really guiding them, giving them the right information, improving outcomes because it's more accurate and catered to their personalized medicine? Do you foresee any challenges there? Is there a point of resistance where maybe it goes too far?
Yeah, and I think to layer on top of that, it's the old, if you ask 10 surgeons, you get 10 opinions situation. So they all don't agree. I'll just give you a simple example that maybe amplifies how correct you are that it's going to be an issue. We launched an app that we were interacting with our surgeons on, and we had different things that different preferences, and it was amazing. Some surgeons were like, "Don't ever send me a notification again, or I'll never use your product." And some were like, wanted every notification every 3 seconds of what was happening. And the span was so immense that it was crazy. And I think in surgery, you get that same situation. Some of them really want like a really in-depth, the robot to do almost everything. They're happy they could sit back and watch the robot do and pin, and some want to be very intimately involved. So I think it's going to have to be versatile. They just don't agree.
Yeah.
And they've all had different training, and that's the universal thing I think we've learned.
Yep.
I think any platform that takes away everything from them might work for some surgeons, but it will fail for others.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In one of my lives, I remember we were looking at a company that, or working with a company that would take video of procedures, right? And essentially crowdsource to surgeons, hey, watch this procedure and kind of judge it, right?
Sure.
Right, anonymously and all that sort of great stuff, right? And what they found is that they, unsurprisingly, that you could identify best practices pretty easily and connect that to outcomes pretty easily, right? And then you say, gee, that's wonderful. You can use these videos for training. Hey, don't you want to be part of this?
Yep.
And you get 50 million opinions from certain. Well, I'm not sure I want to touch that, right?
Yep.
But you have a tool that really has demonstrably improved outcomes, right, for individual surgeons. And so the take up for that, it just reminds me of the same thing, just different opinions.
Yeah, and robotics was an enabler to that, and I've worked in that space some, and obviously it's been over a decade now that they've been tracking that. So there literally is efficiency information, and they've compiled a lot of data sets of different procedures, and now they have the baseline gold standard, and they can basically track a physician's ability to come as close to that gold standard or not. So even the hospital administrators are looking to kind of apply some pressure. So the physicians aren't going to necessarily like that, but the technology actually is an enabler to applying some pressure there as well.
Yeah, the same way that showing people performance data live on the factory improves performance, unsurprisingly works in that.
Yeah.
Sort of suite.
Maybe a demotivator. So let's shift a little bit. So we just talked a lot about the physician, obviously a key stakeholder in this as well, but the patient. is more and more of a stakeholder. So I mentioned that the physicians are really looking for data to make informed decisions. I think now it's become more and more a norm where the actual patient wants to be a stakeholder and wants to be part of their care. And you mentioned now that even the major medicals are actually targeting the patients and selling to the patients rather than selling to the doctors. So let's talk about that, actually. How do you see that continuing to evolve or play out and allowing the actual patients to become more and more involved?
I'll answer on major, but I think that the personalized aspect of it is much more fascinating. But as I said, that the part of the shift in paradigm now is you're selling outcomes to patients, right? Which means that you're having much more direct communication with patients. You're understanding who they are. You understand what their preferences are, and it allows you to also directly affect patient satisfaction, right? So the medical outcomes, the medical percentage of good outcomes for example, knee surgery, right, have been going up and up and up. It's a super high outcome surgery. Patient satisfaction hasn't been tracking that, right? And it's not close, which is weird because people are getting surgeries which are medically fine and they aren't coming out with a good experience, right? And I think that this trying to stay closer to the patient, understand who they were preoperatively, and then work with them in their rehab postoperatively, improves satisfaction. That's great. That's not only great for that particular patient, but it's great for the cohort of potential patients, right? Because in general, people defer, I can't remember what the numbers were, like 10 years or something. They defer getting a knee surgery a decade longer than they really ought to, right? Given the life potential that they're losing by given the loss of mobility, right? And so at some level, it behooves the large-scale medicals to really work more closely with patients and understand what their issues are, and also work to improve their satisfaction, because it's going to improve the cohort of people who want to use our products, right?
Yeah, I was struck by, what we had a patient once that asked to join a design call with a surgeon. So there was you have a surgeon working on a product for that patient. We have their imaging data, and so we said, yeah, sure, you can join this call. And we haven't figured out if everyone wants to do that or if that's a part what they want to do. But it really made me realize that in classical kind of orthopedic models, and in many models, especially in orthopedics, the med device company doesn't really interact with the patient, even though that patient walks around with our implant for the rest of their life, in many cases. And we're a big part of that. Like, the hospital is the place where it happens, the doctor's the care provider, and then we're sort of this third leg, and we're not interacting well with them. And I think the larger companies and ourselves are realizing that we have to change that. We have to find ways where we can interact directly with the patients and have their consent to do so. But I think that there's some that I think is coming. You see that outside of orthopedics, obviously, if like companies like Dexcom, others that have continuous glucose monitoring, they're already interacting with patients. It's just not as common in orthopedics, but I think that's coming.
So that's amazing. So the patient actually participated in the preoperative planning meeting with the physician?
Yes. Yeah, and so we haven't broadly opened that up yet, but we're trying to think about how to do that and what they'd like to see, and and we've had patients that have contacted us directly and said, we found your information, I'm an engineer, I'm interested. So I think there's there can be disadvantages too to having them involved. So we're trying to manage some of that. But I think it is, how do we become part of the patient's journey more so than just the implant? I mean, again, and then, like Zimmer Biomet has now a sensor in their knee, so that they're also been more involved in the patient journey post-operatively, because they're tracking what's happening and the patient's signed consent to that. And, I think there's a lot of issues around all those things, but I think that's part of the future.
Wow. And how did the physician react to that? You mentioned no physician's the same. I imagine some would not like that.
Yeah, it varies.
Yeah.
Physicians are also even just forget the patient for a second. We get some physicians who say, I don't want to be involved in the call. Send me an implant and I'll tell you if I like it, which is never ideal. And then they don't like it usually. All the way to someone who wants 20 calls. They're like, I got a new idea for the implant. So it's a wide variation.
It's a weird paradigm. Consumers are becoming more and more and more accustomed to having choice, to getting the thing that they want, to getting the thing that they want immediately, right? And having a bunch of things to select from and being able to look at reviews and Yelps or whatever to say, who liked this and what did it do for them, and be able to dive into that. We're accustomed to do that in just about every sphere where we can call the shots, except this one, it would appear, and politics perhaps, right? And that's about it. And that's got to change.
Yep.
It won't change in politics, but it'll change in this.
All right, so another slight shift in topic, but I think it's related. You just mentioned the sensors actually in the implant, and I see a real emerging trend in both drug delivery systems as well as medtech spaces of really kind of doing efficacy and adherence platforms. And it's obviously enabled by these digital ecosystems as well, too. So another area I'll ask, I personally see this as emerging. I think both of you have a lot of experience in orthopedic. How would you say the current maturity is there of just the ability to add technology to really kind of track the efficacy of the actual surgery itself, but then also to really kind of enable the patient to be in control and kind of encouraging them to follow a care plan and be adherent to it, and then also track the progression of their healing over time?
Yeah, I think we're probably orthopedics a little bit behind there. Some other areas, there is one of the reasons for that, quite simply, is that orthopedics, there's a lot of 510K clearances where clinical data is not required for a new implant, and so you're not running these type of studies. And not that's a problem necessarily, but that means you're not doing it. And then a clinical study is very expensive, so you'd have to bolt that on top of that to really track patient outcomes. I do think that with the Zimmer knee, which is one of the first to have it inside the knee, there's some external devices that people are looking at. I do think with that combined with digital health and other platforms interact, my hope is we'll get better at tracking patients in orthopedics, and particularly because I feel if you think of orthopedics, if you really, really boil it down, you either are in pain or you can't move something. And those are very easy things to report. And so patients should be able to tell us, and we should be able to track how their motion is today. And we're not really actively doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add a lot to that. I do think that there's, it's becoming more and more common, post-op to see sort of recovery programs or apps because you can, the tech has gotten better for what people the tech has gotten better and people are more used to using tech on their cell phones and having digital interactions with their care providers, and you see payers, I think, also beginning to push this because they see faster outcomes and less chance of complications downstream. So I think on the app side, I think the thing that has been slow is connecting that directly on the implant side to sensors in the implant, and that I completely agree with you.
Yeah, it clearly could be a differentiator, right? I mean, you're talking about selling to patients. I mean, if you're able to kind of track that progression of healing over time and actually document it with data, it could be a real differentiator as well. And I could see it becoming the expectation that people want to kind of, you mentioned the Yelp review, right? I mean, if I personally was going to go through a procedure like that, I would look for an ability to understand the best physician, the best actual implants in there as well.
In patients we found in some of our early studies, we're developing some interaction tools for the patients directly, and we've discovered that patients do want to understand how they're doing relative to other patients and actively and on demand. They don't necessarily want to have to go back into the office and be like, how am I doing, doc? They want something almost a little more gamified. So that's stuff we're trying to explore.
Yep. Any thoughts or plans on adding technology to your implants, if you can say?
Yes. I do think it's a good area. Yes, we are actively working in that, and I would put that as a very farther out technology, but I think you have to be thinking about the sensor side in the implants.
Great.
Similarly, yes, but I'm probably done.
Yeah.
Yes, be more carefully.
Even more careful. How about robotics? I know you both, or Sarath, especially yourself, have experience there as well, too. I mean, do you see this continuing to trend? You made some interesting points before of the robotics becoming more of a commodity in some applications.
Yes, I think the interesting question is going to be at what point can you really leverage the power of the sensing and the compute because eventually, as with any system, the human judgment is probably going to be the weak point, right, in the middle of a surgery, right, as it is in the middle of, a manufacturing operation. So I think it's trying to get closer and closer and closer to, at least in certain vectors, being able to do autonomous work. And that probably requires really good stitching together of sensing information and a simple procedure that you can show outcomes on.
Yep.
That will continue to push that. Right now, for knees, I think we said it was something like 10, 12, 13% or so are robotic, right? And yet there's a real strong push there. And that push, at least from what I've seen, has been from patients, right? I had a boss once who used to say that, patients love robots and surgeons love patients and hospitals love surgeons, so hospitals love robots,
Yep.
right? And so just another case of marketing the capability directly to the consumer because they have an interest in it. And that's without really patients knowing anything about outcome data from robotic surgeries, right? And I think as we begin to get more of those and there's more of a focus on talking directly to the patients, that growth will continue.
That's great. I'm glad you got that in. I think that's a good line that I'm going to steal, by the way. So I think that kind of wraps it up. I'll give just a quick summation there. I mean, I think thank you both for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I mean, I think some of the key takeaways there are just where personalized care is going. I think that clearly is the future, enabled by digital, but the patients are going to become a bigger and bigger part of that, and the expectation that just no two bodies are created equal and anything that's going in them shouldn't be the same. So I think there's a real opportunity here, and I think it's an exciting time. Cool. So now the questions. So hopefully you guys are engaged, and I'll open it up to the room if anybody has any questions. Please. I got you almost to the
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, can you just speak up the last part of what you said?
Sure. I was curious on your thoughts with the trend we might see with direct-to-patient marketing. So it's great, direct-to-consumer, digital robotics marketing. But do you see that developing a trend and becoming more patient-involved?
Yeah, I don't mind going first. I mean, I think we kind of touched on that a few times, but yes, I think that will. I think we're already seeing that shift, and I see it progressing even more. Look at drugs, right? I mean, that's really, they're getting ahead of that. You're walking into your office now knowing the name brand of the thing that you want to ask your physician to prescribe, and I think the pharmaceutical companies tapped into that a long time ago. And now all of a sudden, I think you're seeing the med tech companies actually making a similar play there as well too. And I think that's really the advantage of we were talking about adding technology and building a body of evidence and really being able to differentiate. But now all of a sudden you can market that information and that data set to the patient. So I think some of the apps that go along with that, or some of the ecosystem starting with information that's available to the patient, I think that puts them on the right road as well too. So I think that there's some real strategy that these companies are already starting to employ, and I see that continuing over time. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think the larger joint companies did some direct-to-patient marketing, I think maybe 20 years. I mean, it was a big trend. I think one of the difficulties back then was it was pretty expensive to deploy, and they didn't necessarily get the return. I think they're re-examining it because it might be a little less to deploy possibly, and maybe the returns there. So I think we're going to see some of that coming back.
Or supporting it regionally through, a major hospital system customer,
Yeah.
and supporting their efforts to do that. I've seen that too. But yeah, it's astonishing to me that you didn't see more of that even 10 years. I've got a screw in my shoulder and I couldn't tell you who made it, and I'm in the industry, right?
Please.
Just a bit, the advent of ownership of technology and our data, right, for the consumers, own our data. Has there been any thought to this idea of, CT scans of our bodies when we're 20, so that CT scan maybe becomes the hit when I'm 60, and then we're, something. Now I have my best self document somewhere. Are we evaluating or able to evaluate technology like that with digital health records or anything complicated?
So I've been in a couple of discussions where people have been talking that way. I think it's a really big data problem, right? Not just in storage or in cost of trying to get, CT scans are pricey. but in curation as well. So how do you make sure that you're looking at the data the same way or have translations over the course of that 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? So the VHS tape of your CT scan from 20 years ago, what are you going to do with that, right? So I think that there are some big sort of technical prediction challenges that are coming for that.
Yeah, and we have been thinking about some of that. Does it have to be CT? It could be a DEXA scan. Maybe something that's a little bit less. We do, for example, if someone has a really bad, let's say a motor vehicle accident, they lose part of this, we use the contralateral side. That's not always available or able to be used the right way. So then you would need something like that. Would be helpful. But but I think the data side's, even when we started hiring data scientists in our company, we actually didn't have them to start with. And I think even all the big ortho, it's pretty new. They were just like, it came in and said, you guys aren't even storing your data right. I mean, we were like at ground level. So I think a lot for all of us to learn on that side.
Any other questions?
Personalized care set, how does that scale? So my background in product management, marketing, I think about like my sales force in the field. How are we keeping up, or how do you see some of the demand for the increase in case of business orders?
Yeah, it is technology based. So if you attempt to scale it without the right technologies in place, it's very difficult. You have to have particularly digital design. I mean, you can't have cases that take 8 hours to design that are happening very, very, very frequently, and then you have to, if the surgeon doesn't like it, it's another 8 hours. So that, and then I think the printing side has made a huge difference. That's part of the merge between Conformis and Restor3D, because we're going to start to print some of their products that were not printed before, and we're hoping faster. And printers are getting faster, so that what we could print in 6 hours or 6 days before, maybe we can get overnight now. And so I think that's part of scaling. There's a whole logistics and difficult problem there too that's new that also has to scale. We as a business are focused on a lot on complex cases, revisions, so not necessarily always the biggest markets, but the ones that have good price points and actually more of a need for personalization.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, you hit the harder cases that maybe demand a little bit more cost or customization, and stay away from the commodity ones. But then you eventually do enough of those, you start to build an infrastructure and scale that can permeate more and more into the more traditional.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, let's eat lunch.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All.